Peter Sutcliffe. For 5 years, across the north of England, women were told not to walk home alone after dark. A man the newspapers had named the Yorkshire Ripper was moving through West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, and the police could not catch him. They pulled one lorry driver from Bradford in for questioning 9 separate times, and 9 separate times they let him walk back out the door. His name was Peter Sutcliffe. The first woman whose life he took was Wilma McCann, 28 years old, a mother of 4 from Leeds. She was found in the early hours of October 30th, 1975, and at the time no one understood that she was the beginning of anything. Over the next 5 years, Sutcliffe would take the lives of 13 women in total and attempt to harm 7 more who survived. The youngest of those he took was a teenager. The others ranged in age from 18 to 42, and each new discovery deepened a panic that spread across 2 counties. By day, Sutcliffe was married, employed, and unremarkable. He drove long-distance haulage routes and drew almost no attention to himself. Years earlier, working as a gravedigger, he had told people he heard the voice of God, but colleagues treated it as an oddity rather than a warning. That ordinariness was exactly what allowed him to keep moving through the investigation unnoticed. The inquiry that hunted him became one of the largest and most troubled in British history. Detectives received a series of letters and a taped message from a man claiming to be the killer, speaking with a distinctive northeastern accent. The investigation shifted to match that voice, and officers began ruling out anyone who did not sound like the man on the tape. Sutcliffe did not, so each time his name surfaced, he was set aside. The hoaxer behind that tape was not identified and convicted until decades later. Sutcliffe was finally stopped on January 2nd, 1981, in Sheffield, sitting in a car fitted with false number plates alongside a young woman. A probationary constable ran a routine check on the plates. It was the following day, when a sergeant returned to the scene on a hunch and recovered items Sutcliffe had quietly discarded, that the full picture emerged. 2 days after his arrest, he confessed and declared that he was the man they had been looking for. So the question that would shadow the inquiry for years was a simple one. How had a man interviewed 9 times been allowed to remain free? At his trial in 1981, Sutcliffe admitted responsibility, but asked the court to accept a reduced charge on grounds of diminished responsibility, citing paranoid schizophrenia. 4 psychiatrists supported that diagnosis, and the prosecution was prepared to accept it. The trial judge, Sir Leslie Boreham, refused to let the matter be settled quietly and insisted a jury decide. Speaking of the man behind the hoax tape, Boreham told the court that the scent had been falsified by a cynical and almost inhuman hoaxer. On May 22, 1981, the jury convicted Sutcliffe on all 13 counts. He received 20 concurrent life sentences, with a recommendation that he serve at least 30 years. In 2010, the High Court went further and imposed a whole-life order, meaning he would never be released. Appeals against that decision were rejected. In 1984, he was moved to Broadmoor, the high-security hospital, where he was attacked several times and lost the sight of one eye. In 2016, a tribunal ruled he no longer required hospital treatment, and he was returned to the prison system, arriving at the County Durham facility known as Frankland, among the most heavily guarded men in the country. For the families, his death brought no simple relief. Robert McCann, the son of his first victim, said the news gave him a measure of closure, and that he had chosen to forgive the man who had taken his mother, something he admitted he could never have said in the years when he was consumed by anger. As of today, Peter Sutcliffe is dead. He died on November 13, 2020, at the age of 74, in a hospital near the prison, from complications linked to the coronavirus. He never spent a day as a free man again. That failure to protect the public came from an inquiry that simply could not see the man in front of it. Frankland's next resident presented the opposite failure. He did not slip past the system. He was the system, a serving officer sworn to protect the very public he chose to harm. Wayne Couzens. On the night of March 3, 2021, a woman walking home through South London was stopped by a man showing a police warrant card. To anyone passing, it looked like an officer making a lawful arrest during the pandemic. It was not. The man was a serving firearms officer with the Metropolitan Police, and the woman he handcuffed and led away was Sarah Everard. Sarah was 33 years old, a marketing executive walking a familiar route home after visiting a friend. She did everything a person is told to do to stay safe. She stayed on well-lit roads. She called her partner along the way, and she trusted the uniform of the man who approached her. That trust was the weapon used against her. Wayne Couzens, born in 1972, used his warrant card and handcuffs to stage a false arrest, claiming she had breached coronavirus rules. He drove her out of London to Kent, where he assaulted her and took her life, then attempted to conceal what he had done. Her remains were later found in Woodland. Witnesses who had seen the roadside stop assumed they were watching genuine police work. What the investigation later uncovered was that this was not a sudden collapse of character. In the months before, Couzens had been reported for exposing himself, including at a fast food outlet only days before he took Sarah's life. Those reports were not acted on in time. One of the workers who had reported him would later say that if he had been held to account when they came forward, Sarah might still be alive. You'd think someone would have said something. Someone did. Nobody stopped him. Couzens pleaded guilty to kidnap and to the assault in June of that year, and to taking her life the following month. That left only the sentencing, and it raised a difficult question. How do you punish a man who used the very authority meant to protect the public to do the opposite? On September 30th, 2021, Lord Justice Fulford answered it. He imposed a whole life order, an extraordinarily rare sentence for the taking of a single adult life. Fulford explained that the police occupy a unique position, holding powers of coercion and control that set them apart from every other public servant, and that Couzens had abused those powers in the most fundamental way. He described Sarah as a wholly blameless victim and found that Couzens had effectively gone hunting for a lone young woman to seize. Couzens's own barrister acknowledged that a whole life term had never before been passed for a single killing outside of cases involving a child, a public figure, or terrorism. Sarah's family spoke in court. Her father addressed Couzens directly, telling him that no punishment he received would ever match the torture he had inflicted on them, and that for him there could be no redemption. Her sister described a predator who had prowled the streets looking for prey, and asked how he had dared to take Sarah from her. The case reshaped a national conversation about women's safety and about trust in policing itself. In the days after Sarah's remains were found, a vigil held in her memory on Clapham Common ended in scenes of officers dragging women away, which only deepened the public anger. A senior officer said the case should make everyone in policing hang their heads in shame. A later public inquiry concluded that Couzens should never have been a police officer at all, pointing to warning signs across his career that were repeatedly missed, and finding that opportunities to stop him had been let slip for years. In the aftermath, forces across the country were pressed to re-examine how officers are vetted, and the case became a byword for the abuse of police power. He was moved to Frankland to begin a sentence that will not end. In a separate hearing in 2023, He was sentenced to a further 19 months for 3 counts of indecent exposure, including incidents at a drive-thru in the weeks before he took Sarah's life. His attempt to challenge his whole life order was rejected by the courts. As of today, Wayne Couzens remains inside Frankland under a whole life order. He will not be released, and he will die in prison. Couzens turned the symbols of protection into tools of harm, and he will die in prison for it. Not every notorious man inside Frankland is there for taking a life, though. Some built their reputation another way entirely, over the course of almost 50 years. Charles Bronson. He has been called the most violent prisoner in Britain, a man who has spent the better part of half a century behind bars, most of it in solitary confinement. He has taken hostages, fought guards, and staged rooftop protests. And here is the part that surprises people. In all those decades inside, Charles Bronson has never taken a single life. He was born Michael Gordon Peterson in Luton in 1952. His route into the prison system was almost mundane. In 1974, aged 22, he was sentenced to 7 years for an armed robbery. That original sentence should have ended in the early 1980s. Instead, it became the seed of a prison career that has now lasted nearly 50 years. That's not a typo, by the way. What kept him inside was not the robbery. It was what he did once he was there. Bronson became known for a long series of violent incidents and hostage-takings within the prison walls, targeting doctors, prison staff, and fellow inmates. He took a deputy governor hostage at Frankland itself. He seized other prisoners at Belmarsh. And in one of his most serious episodes, in 1999 at Hull, he held a prison education worker for 44 hours after the man had criticized one of his drawings. The man he held during that siege later took the case to the authorities and won an out-of-court settlement of £65,000, saying the ordeal had left his career in ruins. An earlier siege at Belmarsh, where he had held 3 inmates, had already added 7 years to his time, later reduced to 5 on appeal. For the Hull incident, Bronson received a discretionary life sentence in the year 2000, with a minimum term of just 3 years. Yet 3 years came and went, and he stayed. Over the decades, he was shuttled between the country's most secure institutions, among them Frankland, Wakefield, Woodhill, Belmarsh, and Parkhurst, and for a period, he was held in Broadmoor, the same high-security hospital that once housed Peter Sutcliffe. Wherever he went, the pattern followed him. He became, in his own way, one of the most recognizable names in the British prison system, better known than many of the men serving time for far graver crimes. His personal life played out in fragments from inside. He married for the first time in 1972, a marriage that ended in divorce. He married again in 2001, and a third time in 2017, to an actress in a wedding held inside prison. That third marriage was annulled in 2019. Along the way, he adopted new names, first taking the surname Bronson, and then in August 2014 changing it to Charles Salvador, in tribute to the artist Salvador Dali. So what do you do with a prisoner who has served his original sentence many times over, but cannot seem to stop breaking the rules of confinement? In March 2023, he tried to answer that himself. He was granted a rare public parole hearing, streamed so the process could be seen openly. He told the panel, in his own colorful phrasing, that he had endured more prison meals than a character from a children's story, and that he was sick of it. The parole board was not persuaded. It refused to release him and declined to recommend a move to open conditions, pointing to his long history of persistent rule-breaking and to the fact that he seemed to see little wrong with it. A psychologist told the hearing he would always value violence, though he had mellowed with age. The panel admitted something unsettling in its own conclusion, that it was not fully clear what was keeping his risk contained. For all the notoriety, the core fact of his case is strange. He is not a man who took lives on the outside. He is a man whose violence has almost entirely been directed at the system holding him, and who has, through that violence, made himself impossible to release. As of today, Charles Bronson, now legally Charles Salvador, remains in the high-security prison system, having spent close to 50 years inside, much of it alone in a cell. He has not been granted release, and no date has been set for one. Bronson's violence stayed contained inside the walls, never aimed at the wider world. The man in the following case used violence for the opposite reason. He wanted the whole world watching. Michael Adebolajo. On the afternoon of May 22, 2013, on a busy street in Woolwich, southeast London, two men used a car to strike a young soldier walking back to his barracks. What followed happened in full public view, and then the men did not run. They waited in the road for the police to arrive, and one of them, hands still marked from the attack, spoke calmly into a bystander's phone camera to explain why he had done it. The soldier was Fusilier Lee Rigby, 25 years old, a drummer in his regiment, and a father to a young son. He was off duty and in civilian clothes, walking near his barracks on an ordinary weekday. He had served his country, and he was chosen precisely because he was a soldier. He had no chance to defend himself. The two men responsible were Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale. After running Rigby down, they attacked him with bladed weapons and took his life in the street, then dragged him into the road and lingered at the scene. Adebolajo told the passerby filming him that he had acted to avenge Muslims overseas and described himself as a soldier. And somehow, it gets worse, because both men had been on the radar of the security services across several separate investigations in the years beforehand, and still the attack was not prevented. The killing was captured on phones and on nearby cameras, and it was designed to be. The men made no attempt to hide their identities, because publicity was the point. This raised a question the courts had to confront directly. What sentence fits a crime committed deliberately in public, staged to be seen by as many people as possible? Adebolajo, British-born and of Nigerian descent, had been raised a Christian before converting to Islam and falling in with a network of known extremists. He had studied at university and had once seemed set on an ordinary path, before drifting toward the ideology that would define him. His co-defendant, Michael Adebowale, was younger and had been drawn into the same circle. Together, they had planned an act intended not just to end a life, but to send a message. Adebolajo was convicted on December 19, 2013. On February 26, 2014, Mr. Justice Sweeney passed sentence. Adebolajo received a whole life order. His co-defendant received a minimum term of 45 years. Sweeney told the court that the two men had gloried in the bloodshed they had caused, and that Adebolajo had shown no genuine insight into what he had done and no real remorse for it. He described the attack as sickening and pitiless, and as a betrayal of the faith the men claimed to be defending. He found that they had chosen to take a soldier's life in broad daylight, in public, in a way calculated to generate the maximum possible coverage. Both men struggled with guards and were removed from the dock during proceedings. Questions followed almost immediately about whether the attack could have been prevented. Adebolajo had come to the attention of the security services across several separate investigations in the years beforehand, and a later parliamentary review examined how he had remained free to act despite that scrutiny. The killing landed like a shock across the country. Outside the court, far-right demonstrators gathered and even erected a mock gallows, while prosecutors framed the attack for what it was, an act of terrorism carried out to advance a violent cause. Rigby's widow told the world that no one expects to see something like this on the streets of the United Kingdom, and spoke of a son who would grow up seeing images of his father that no child should ever have to face. His mother, some years later, refused to accept an apology from Adebolajo, saying she would never forgive him. Adebolajo has not been a quiet prisoner. During an incident at Belmarsh not long after his arrest, he lost 2 front teeth in a struggle with officers, and later pursued a legal claim over it. He was eventually moved to Frankland to serve his sentence among the country's most closely controlled inmates. As of today, Michael Adebolajo remains inside Frankland under a whole life order. He will not be released, and he will die in prison. Adebolajo staged a single act of violence for an audience. The story that follows begins far more quietly, with a police raid on an unremarkable flat, and a man nobody in the room had recognized: Kamel Bourgass. In early 2003, counter-terrorism officers believed they had uncovered a plot to spread poison across Britain. They raided a flat in North London and found handwritten recipes for lethal substances, a stash of castor beans, and thousands of pounds in cash. The story of a poison cell in London spread quickly, and it reached the highest levels of government. But there was a detail that would take 2 more years to surface, and it changed everything. At the center of it was Kamel Bourgass, an Algerian national who had entered the United Kingdom illegally hidden in a lorry around the turn of the millennium. He had drifted through the margins, without settled status, and had attached himself to extremist circles. To the outside world he was invisible, which was part of what made him dangerous. The flat raided in January 2003, above a pharmacy in Wood Green, contained the instructions and materials that fueled the alarm. But one detail would be misunderstood for years. The government's own scientific laboratory found no actual poison had been produced in that flat. The recipes and intent were real, but the finished substance everyone feared had never existed. That correction did not come until 2005, long after the supposed London poison cell had already been cited in a speech to the United Nations. In simpler terms, the toxin that frightened a nation and made it into a global address had never actually been there. The genuine tragedy came a few days later, and it was not chemical at all. On January 14, 2003, officers carried out a separate raid at a flat in Manchester, part of an immigration and counter-terror operation. Bourgass was present, but had not been recognized as the man they were hunting, and he had not been restrained. He seized a kitchen knife and fatally harmed Detective Constable Stephen Oak, a 40-year-old Special Branch officer, striking him repeatedly. Oak kept trying to hold on to his attacker even as he suffered fatal wounds. 3 other officers were harmed in the struggle and survived. So what do the courts do with a man who set out to spread fear and took the life of a police officer in the process? Bourgass was convicted of Detective Constable Oak's killing in the summer of 2004 and received a life sentence with a minimum term of 22 years, alongside further time for the attacks on the surviving officers. In a second trial, concluding in April 2005, he was convicted of conspiracy relating to the poison plot and given a further 17 years. Across both cases, the courts established a man committed to causing mass harm who had, in the end, taken a single life with an ordinary kitchen knife. Stephen Oak was remembered as an officer who died protecting others. The head of the Counter-Terrorism Command said the conviction had removed a very dangerous man from the streets, that Oak had died shielding the public from a vicious threat, and that the country had been spared a real and deadly danger. Oak's own father, a man of deep faith, publicly forgave his son's killer. More than 1,000 mourners attended the funeral, among them the Prime Minister of the day. In the years since, Oak has been remembered as an example of extraordinary courage, an officer who kept trying to hold on to a dangerous man long after most people would have let go. His time at Frankland was marked by further violence. In 2008, other inmates set his cell alight while he was held there. He was later moved out of Frankland and transferred to a different high-security prison, where more recent records place him. As of today, Camel Bourgass is no longer held at Frankland. He is serving his sentence at another high-security facility. He became eligible to be considered for parole in January 2026, and on the 2nd of February 2026, the parole board refused to release him. Bourgass believed he was serving a cause when he took the life of a police officer. The man whose case comes next also acted in the name of an ideology, but his target was not a stranger caught up in a raid. It was an elected member of parliament, chosen deliberately, and confronted in broad daylight on a quiet street. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thomas Mair. A week before the country voted on whether to leave the European Union, a member of parliament was holding a routine surgery for the people she represented in a small West Yorkshire town. She was 41 years old, a mother of two, and one of the most respected new voices in the House of Commons. Outside the library where she was due to meet constituents, a quiet, reclusive man was waiting for her. His name was Thomas Mair. Joe Cox had spent years working for humanitarian causes before entering politics, much of it with aid organizations, helping people caught in crisis around the world. She had been elected as a member of parliament only the year before, and had quickly built a reputation for compassion across party lines. She was married with 2 young children. She had no idea that a stranger had fixed on her as a target. On June 16, 2016, in the town of Birstall, Mair confronted her in the street and took her life using a firearm and a blade. When a 77-year-old bystander named Bernard Kenny tried to intervene, he too was harmed, though he survived. Witnesses described Mair shouting a political slogan as he acted. When he was later asked his name at his first court appearance, he did not give it. Instead, he offered a slogan about traitors and freedom, telling the court everything it needed to know about what had driven him. There was a bitter contrast at the heart of the case. In her first speech to Parliament, Joe Cox had argued that people across communities have far more in common with one another than the things that divide them. It was a message of unity, and it made her a target for a man who believed the opposite with murderous conviction. Mair had no criminal record. What investigators found at his home was a substantial collection of material tied to neo-Nazi and white supremacist movements, including items traced back to an American far-right organization he had bought from decades earlier. He had lived quietly for years, and no one around him had raised an alarm. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The bystander who had tried to save her deserves to be remembered too. Bernard Kenny, a 77-year-old former miner, threw himself at the attacker despite his age and was seriously wounded for it. He was later recognized for his bravery, a reminder that even in the worst moments, someone stepped forward. So what drives a man with no history of violence to take the life of a public servant he had never met? Mair was convicted on November 23, 2016, at the Old Bailey, of the taking of Joe Cox's life, of causing grievous bodily harm, and of weapons offenses. Mr. Justice Wilkie imposed a whole life order. He found that the act had been carried out to advance a political, racial, and ideological cause, one rooted in violent white supremacism and the exclusive nationalism most associated with Nazism. Wilkie told Mair directly that he was no patriot. that by his actions he had betrayed the very democracy his country stood for, and that he had not even had the courage to admit and acknowledge what he had done. The prosecution described the crime as an act of terrorism designed to advance a twisted ideology. Joe Cox's family responded not with rage, but with something closer to pity. They said they felt only sorrow for a man whose life had been so devoid of love that his sole way of finding meaning was to attack a defenseless woman who represented the best of the country in an act of supreme cowardice. Her husband and colleagues across the political spectrum paid tribute to her. Campaigning for the referendum was briefly suspended out of respect, and her death left a mark on public life that has not faded. Throughout his trial, Mayer offered no explanation and expressed no remorse, remaining silent as the evidence against him was laid out. As of today, Thomas Mayer remains inside Frankland under a whole life order. He will not be released, and he will die in prison. Mayer aimed his ideology at a single person he had chosen. The man whose case comes next aimed his at thousands of strangers and came closer than almost anyone realized to pulling it off. Diren Barot. He had drawn up plans to pack limousines with gas cylinders and explosives and leave them beneath busy buildings. He had scouted financial landmarks in New York and Washington and sketched out a radioactive device meant to spread panic and contamination through a crowded city. And yet, when counterterrorism officers finally arrested him, he had no money, no vehicles, and no explosives at all. Even so, he was described as one of the most dangerous men Al-Qaeda ever placed on British soil. Diren Barot was born in India in 1971 and moved to the United Kingdom as a small child. He was raised in a Hindu family in North London, worked for a time as an airline ticketing agent, and converted to Islam at the age of 20. In the mid-1990s, he traveled to fight against Indian forces in the disputed region of Kashmir, and afterward trained at camps linked to Al-Qaeda. He even wrote a book promoting violent struggle, published under an assumed name, which circulated widely in extremist circles. By the early 2000s, he had become a trusted and committed operative. His plans were ambitious to the point of grandiosity. He led what became known as the Financial Buildings Plot, which included the scheme to use gas-filled limousines, a proposal for a radioactive dirty bomb, and detailed reconnaissance of major targets carried out in the years before the September 11th attacks. Among the sites he studied were the New York Stock Exchange, a major banking headquarters, the offices of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, and a large corporate building in Newark. Much of that surveillance had been done as early as the year 2000, long before anyone understood what he was preparing. He was arrested in a North London barbershop on August 3, 2004, with none of the money, vehicles, or explosives needed to carry any of it out. So how do you sentence a plot that never left the page? In 2006, Barot pleaded guilty to conspiracy to take life, in what was reported as the first conviction of its kind in the country for plotting to take lives on such a mass scale. The plans had been set out in detailed documents recovered by investigators, laying bare the sophistication of what he had envisioned, even though not a single device had ever been built. What alarmed the courts was not how close he had come, but how serious and deliberate the intent had been. On November 7, 2006, he was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 40 years. On appeal in May 2007, that minimum was reduced to 30 years, with the court finding the plots had not advanced far enough to justify the higher figure. The judge who first sentenced him described Barot as the instigator of the entire plan, and one of the country's senior counterterrorism officers called him a long-term, dedicated, and committed member of Al-Qaeda. Prosecutors argued that, had even one of his schemes been carried through, It could have caused casualties on a scale the country had rarely seen. 7 of his associates, a group based around the town of Luton, were later jailed for a combined total running to well over 100 years. His time inside Frankland turned violent in a way he had not planned for. In July 2007, Barreau was attacked by other inmates and scalded with boiling liquid, injuries serious enough that he spent several days in hospital under a temporary news blackout. Such attacks were common enough behind those walls to have earned their own grim nickname among prisoners. The man who had plotted mass harm became, briefly, a target himself. As of today, Diran Barreau remains inside Frankland, serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years before he can even be considered for release. Because he was in his mid-30s at the time of sentencing, that term means he could theoretically live to see a parole hearing, though he will be an old man if he does. His case remains one of the most significant terrorism prosecutions the country has seen, cited for years afterward as an example of how far a plot could develop while still stopping short of an actual attack. For now, he stays behind the walls of Frankland, one more name on a list that keeps growing. Barreau planned devastation on a huge scale and, in the end, harmed no one. The next man harmed more people than almost anyone on this list, and did it for decades without being caught. David Fuller. For 33 years, the deaths of 2 young women in Tunbridge Wells sat unsolved. 2 lives taken within months of each other in the same town, and no suspect for more than 3 decades. When a cold case review of the forensic evidence finally produced a match, it led investigators to a quiet hospital electrician. And what they found stored on his computers was, in some ways, even harder to comprehend than the killings. Wendy Nell was 25. Caroline Pierce was 20. Both were young women living ordinary lives in the same town in 1987, when each had her life taken in a separate attack only months apart. For 33 years, the case was known locally as the Bedsit Killings, and it went cold almost immediately, leaving 2 families to grow old without answers and a community unsettled by a pair of deaths no one could solve. David Fuller was a maintenance supervisor and electrician for a National Health Service trust, a job that gave him swipe card access to the mortuaries of more than one hospital. To those around him, he was an unremarkable family man who had held the same sort of work for years, the last person anyone would have suspected of anything. When the forensic review matched him to the 1987 killings, using a precision that decades of earlier investigation had never been able to achieve, he was arrested on December 3, 2020. It was then, as officers examined his devices, that the second and far larger dimension of his offending emerged. Over a period stretching back well over a decade, he had recorded himself abusing the bodies of the dead inside those mortuaries, documented across an archive that ran to more than 20 terabytes of footage. And somehow, it gets worse. Prosecutors concluded he had abused at least 101 people, ranging in age from children to a woman of 100, and many of them have never been identified. Investigators described the scale of what he had done as without any real precedent in the country, a category of offending so far outside ordinary experience that the justice system had little to compare it to. How do you even begin to sentence a man whose victims number in the hundreds, many of whom will never be named? Fuller pleaded guilty in November 2021 to the taking of both women's lives and to more than 50 further offenses. On December 15, 2021, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb imposed a whole-life order. She told him he had become a vulture, picking his victims from among the dead within the hidden world of hospital mortuaries, a world he was free to move through simply because he carried a swipe card, and that he would remain in prison until his death. A further set of charges relating to more victims was admitted the following year, and in December 2022 he was sentenced again, with additional time added. The families spoke of a grief that had no precedent. The widower of one of the women whose life he had taken told him to thank his lucky stars they would never share a cell. The family of the oldest victim said she should have been safe in that mortuary, and clearly had not been, and that they would carry it for the rest of their lives. The mother of Wendy Nell described finding herself crying alone in the dark outside, without knowing how she had got there. The government's health secretary called it a profoundly distressing case, apologized to the families, and ordered an independent inquiry into how a single employee could have moved through hospital mortuaries unchecked for so long. The case also prompted calls to strengthen the law, which at the time set only a modest maximum penalty for offenses of this specific kind. The independent inquiry that followed examined how one employee had been able to move through hospital mortuaries for so long without detection. It reported its findings in stages over the following years, describing serious failures in oversight and security that had allowed his access to go unquestioned. For the families, those conclusions offered explanation, but no comfort. As of today, David Fuller remains inside Frankland under a whole life order. He will not be released, and he will die in prison. Fuller's crimes stayed hidden for decades in the quietest corners of a hospital. The next man's most notorious act happened in the open, inside Frankland itself. Anthony Russell. Over the course of a single week in the autumn of 2020, he took 3 lives across 2 towns in the Midlands. He was already serving a whole life order, already certain to die behind bars, when in early 2026, his name surfaced again, this time from inside Frankland. What he now stands accused of doing in the prison workshop has been reported across the country. Anthony Russell was born in 1982 in Coventry. His defense would later describe a severely abusive childhood and a long struggle with addiction. Over 7 days in October 2020, he took the lives of 3 people in and around Coventry and Leamington Spa. The first was a friend, taken over a jealous and mistaken suspicion. The second was that friend's mother, whose life he took to stop her going to the police. The third was a young woman who was pregnant, whose body he left in Woodland. During the days that followed, as a nationwide search closed in, he also robbed and seriously harmed elderly victims. He was found asleep in a stolen car near Burton-upon-Trent on October 30th, 2020, and told officers plainly that he had done it. What sentence is left for a man the courts have already decided will never leave prison? Russell pleaded guilty to the 3 killings, to a series of robberies, and to causing grievous bodily harm. For the 7 days his spree lasted, he had been among the most wanted men in the country, the subject of urgent public appeals as officers across several forces tried to find him before he harmed anyone else. A jury at Warwick Crown Court convicted him of the further offense against the pregnant victim on March 10, 2022, and he received a lengthy concurrent term for it. The following day, Mr. Justice Wall imposed a whole life order. Wall told the court the case fell squarely within the category of the exceptionally serious, that there had been 3 separate killings, each divided in time and place, and each a sustained and brutal act. He described Russell as a man prepared to use very significant violence against anyone. The prosecution said that while the exact motive for the first killing might never be known, every one of the attacks had been deliberate and cold-hearted, designed to serve his own ends. That should have been the end of his story. It was only the beginning of another. On February 26, 2026, Russell is alleged to have attacked a fellow whole-life inmate inside the prison workshop, striking him with a metal bar. The inmate was Ian Huntley, the man convicted of taking the lives of two young girls in the town of Soham. Huntley, aged 52, suffered severe head injuries and died on March 7, 2026, after life support was withdrawn. Reports from inside the prison claimed Huntley had been bullying Russell in the period before the attack. And no, that detail is not invented, however strange it sounds that one of the country's most reviled prisoners was described as a target himself. On March 10, 2026, the Crown Prosecution Service charged Russell with taking Ian Huntley's life. A prosecutor confirmed the decision to bring the charge. Russell appeared before a court by video link over the following days, and after a series of preliminary hearings, a judge fixed the trial for November 23, 2026, at Newcastle Crown Court. It is important to be clear that this remains an allegation, unproven, and that Russell is entitled to a trial. A conviction would, in any case, change nothing about his sentence, since he is already held under a whole life order. As of today, Anthony Russell remains inside Frankland. He stands charged with taking the life of Ian Huntley and is due to face trial for it in late 2026. That an inmate already serving a whole life order could allegedly take the life of one of the country's most infamous prisoners, inside one of its most secure institutions, drew national attention to what actually goes on behind those walls. That case is not yet resolved, and this part of the story is still unfolding. The killing Russell now stands accused of is the most recent act of bloodshed in Frankland's history. The final name on this list is one of its least known, tied to a police officer's death and a case that took nearly 2 decades to fully close. Muzakkar Shah. When an armed gang raided a travel agency in Bradford in 2005, 2 unarmed officers answered the silent alarm. One of them was a mother of young children who had been in the job for only 9 months. She would not survive the afternoon, and the case her death opened would not be fully closed for another 19 years. Police Constable Sharon Beshanivsky was 38 years old, a mother and stepmother who had joined the force less than a year earlier. The day she responded to that call was her young daughter's 4th birthday. Alongside her was Police Constable Teresa Milburn, 37, her colleague, who would be seriously wounded but survived to describe what happened. Neither woman was armed, and neither knew what was waiting inside. The death of an officer who was also a young mother on a routine afternoon shift sent a wave of grief across the country. On November 18, 2005, a gang led from behind the scenes by an older organizer robbed a travel agency on Morley Street in Bradford, armed with a submachine gun, a pistol, and a knife. Inside, staff were assaulted, tied, and threatened, with the raiders at one point telling them they would harm the youngest present. A silent alarm was triggered. As the gang fled with roughly 5,400 pounds, they were met outside by the 2 responding officers. Muzakkar Shah fired the shot that took Sharon Beshanivsky's life at close range and seriously wounded her colleague. Shah was a Pakistani national, then in his mid-20s, part of a group that also included 2 brothers, one of whom would flee the country before being brought back to face justice. How do you measure justice for an officer who lost her life answering a call for help? Shah was convicted of the taking of the officer's life and of robbery at Leeds Crown Court, and given a life sentence, alongside the 2 brothers who had taken part. In June 2007, a further 9 years were added to his term for firearms offenses committed during an earlier incident, a car chase in which he had been armed the year before the robbery. The colleague who survived, Teresa Milburn, lived with the memory of that afternoon and the loss of the officer beside her, and her account helped anchor the case against the gang. A construction worker who had been at the gang's safe house before the raid gave evidence that he had overheard Shah asking the organizer whether the plan was safe and being reassured that it was, with a target set at tens of thousands of pounds. For years afterward, the man who had organized the whole thing remained beyond reach, having fled to Pakistan. He evaded capture for around 18 years before finally being brought back, convicted of the taking of the officer's life on April 4, 2024, and sentenced the following month to life with a minimum term of 40 years, closing the case nearly 2 decades after it began. Shah's connection to Frankland came from what happened after his conviction. In March 2008, he and one of the brothers had 4 years added to their sentences for wounding another inmate inside the prison. He remains listed among Frankland's most notable prisoners. A detective who worked the case spoke of Sharon Beshanivsky years later, saying she had gone to work to protect the public, that she had answered a call for help alongside her colleague, and that she had tragically never come home. It had taken a generation of police work, spanning 2 countries, to hold everyone involved to account. The organizer who set the robbery in motion was extradited only after years of legal effort, and his conviction in 2024 finally drew a line under a case that had shadowed the force for 19 years. As of today, Muzakkar Shah remains in the high-security prison system, serving a life sentence for the officer whose life he took on a Bradford street. Her name endures on memorials to officers lost in the line of duty, a quiet and lasting counterweight to his own. 10 men, 1 prison, and a set of sentences that in almost every case will end only one way. Frankland was built to hold the people the rest of the system could not, and behind its walls, some of these stories are still being written. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.